Are you confused about whether to use 24 or 30 frames per second when setting up your 2D animation project? I'm going to go over the reasons why you should choose one or the other on today's episode of the Expat Animator. Hey, it's Patrick. Welcome to my Expat Animator series, where I try and help beginners, hobbyists, and independent animators create 2D animations. So 24 or 30 frames per second for your 2D animations. That's what we're going to be talking about. And the first thing we need to know is, what is that FPS? Well, FPS stands for frames per second. So if you didn't already know, that's how many individual frames of film are within a second of footage. So we're going to be using FPS. We're going to see that a lot. And you also might see frame rate. And frame rate is a little different than frames per second. So let's talk about it. So what's the difference between a frame rate and frames per second? Well, for one, frame rates are measured in frames per second. And for another, frame rates are the speed the images are shown on your screen. So what are you animating for? You're going to need to ask yourself that question. So if you're animating in 24 frames per second, some examples of what you would use that for would be movies and film. And 30 frames per second is going to be mobile or TV. Mobile being your smartphone. What FPS should I set my project to? Find out the frame rate of the project you're adding your animation to. So if you're adding your animation to a live video, talk to the director and find out what they're shooting in, because you're going to want to match that with your animation. So remember to create your animation project from the beginning at that same frame rate. And what is less work? The smaller the number, the less drawings you need to draw. So since 24 is less than 30, 24 frames per second will be less work. Why not choose 12 frames per second? Wouldn't that be less work than 24 frames per second? It's better to create your project at 24 frames per second and then animate on the twos, because your frame rate's going to sync up better with the formats that are already out there. You'll get the same result, and your frame rate will match the standard 24 frames per second. When would I use less than 24 frames per second? Animating a GIF, for example, you can go ahead and set your project to less than 24 FPS. If a project specifically asks for a lower frame rate, then go ahead and match that to your project when you're creating your new animated project. Can I mix and match frame rates in my video editing software? You can, but the results are going to be less than optimal. So as much as you can, try and keep your frame rates the same throughout your projects. What frame rate do I personally animate in? It depends. If my video camera is shooting at 30 frames per second, then I'm going to match that in my animation projects. And if I get to choose the frame rate, I usually choose 24 frames per second, just because it's less work. And I kind of like the way that it looks. So what should you choose? Well, it's up to you. If you're adding animation to real-life footage, match the frame rate of your camera. And if your project is 100% animation, I would choose 24 frames per second to lessen your drawings needed. I also have a class on Skillshare that talks about this topic a lot more in depth. It's called Understanding Frame Rates in 2D Animation. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. This has been another episode of the Expat Animator. My name's Patrick Davidson. Thanks for joining me today, and keep on animating. If you found today's video helpful, you might like some of my animation classes over at Skillshare.com. I'll put the link in the description below.